Everybody, this is Tracy here with another edition of A View from Tracy's Point. And as I mentioned in my video about Mr. Kelly's sentencing, I was going to purchase the transcripts from the actual sentencing hearing and read it to you guys. And I actually purchased this a few days ago and totally forgot. Okay, so I apologize, y'all. Y'all know I got a lot going on. So in any event, let's go ahead and jump into this. And for those of you who are unawares, this was the sentencing hearing for Robert Kelly. I did a video on what the result was, but I was basing it on live tweets by this guy named Dave Burns on Twitter. And so now I have the actual transcript so we can see exactly what was said. And I think more importantly, people wanted to hear the full witness impact statements from Rashona Landfair, this Nia chick, and the Pauline girl. And then also exactly what the judge said about the sentencing and about restitution. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm just going to read through the entire transcript. It starts out with the court and it says, okay. Oops, I think I slid down too fast. Let's get back up here to the top. I'm sorry. I don't know what I hit. Okay. And also, you guys know I have struggles with this Adobe Reader because it wants to do what it wants to do. So the hearing was held on February 23rd. It was supposed to be at 10 o'clock a.m., but then a lot of the reporters who were there for the sentencing came back and said, oh my God, they've already started. It started at 9:45. And then as I shared with you all on the video that I did, that reporters from like the Chicago Tribune, the Chicago Sun-Times, they were like all eager and, happy. And then all of a sudden we didn't hear from them anymore. So it was like they kind of sensed that he wasn't going to give Mr. Kelly the sentence that everybody was hoping that he was going to give. And so they didn't really want to live tweet about it. So anyway, let's start off with the clerk, and she calls the case to order. 19 CR 567 United States versus Kelly. The court, which is the judge, I believe, appearances please. And then Jennifer Bonjean says yes. Good morning, Your Honor. Jennifer Bonjean, and she spells her last name, on behalf of Mr. Kelly. And then Ms. Cohen, good morning, Your Honor. Ashley Cohen, also on behalf of Mr. Kelly. And Ashley Cohen is the blonde woman that you often see with Jennifer Bonjean. She's her partner in the Bonjean Law Group. And then Ms. Appington says, good morning, Your Honor. Janice Appington, Elizabeth Pozzalo, Jason Julian, and Brian Williamson on behalf of the United States. And so the judge says, we're here for sentencing, correct? Appington, yes, Your Honor. Judge, are both parties prepared? Appington, yes, Your Honor. Bonjean, yes, Your Honor. And then the judge says, all right. So the documents I have reviewed, and they are substantial. The pre-sentence investigation report, along with the recommendation, the government's memo, the defendant's memo, the government's memo plus exhibit, and the defendant's memo plus exhibits, which include letters that were submitted to both myself and to Judge Donnelly in New York, the report from Dr. Park Dietz and Dr. Renee Sorrentino. The defendant filed a reply memorandum. The government has submitted for restitution reports of attorneys Brown and Rosen, opinions of Dr. Sharon Cooper, opinions of Smith Economics Group, Pauline's victim impact statement, the defense has filed a response to the government's submission for restitution. Anything else I should have? I mean, there's a lot. Anything else I should have that you can recall, Ms. Pozzolo? Yes, Your Honor, Elizabeth Pozzolo. We also submitted a restitution memo on the docket that references a second government's version that attached an impact statement from Rashona and a study that's referenced in there as well. So those were filed yesterday, and we brought copies up to your chambers. The judge, yeah, I did review those. And also, there was a number of pleadings from the lawsuit against an attorney Loggins involving, I believe, Pauline. I did review those. Bonjean, I think it's Nia, Your Honor, but Judge, was it Nia? Appington. Yes, Your Honor, that's Judge. Okay, I'm sorry. Appington. Yeah. Judge, all right. But the memo, the other report was on Pauline yesterday that you sent up. Appington. That's correct, Your Honor. So then the judge says, okay, I have reviewed those. Anything else that I should have seen? Bonjean. Your Honor, obviously we have some objections to the restitution issues, but perhaps we should just table that until I don't know how the court wants to go. Judge, well, we will proceed with the sentencing and then I'll proceed to restitution after we complete the sentencing. That would be the way I propose to do it. Now, Ms. Bonjean, have you reviewed the pre-sentence investigation report? Bonjean, yes, Your Honor. Judge, have you discussed it with your client? Bonjean, I have. Judge, now I understand you have one objection to the guideline calculations. Eliminating that, factually, are there matters that you wish to call to my attention you believe to be incorrect? I'm not talking about the legal issue of the guidelines, but factually, as far as the history of your client, things of that nature. Bonjean, Your Honor, in our memorandum, we did point out some factual objections based on factual misstatements, primarily that appear in the recommendation. So I would just draw the court's attention, I believe, let's see. I put it in footnote 2. I've identified some of those factual misstatements, and just for the record, for example, the characterization of the conduct with Nia somehow being over an extended period of time or that it wasn't a 1 or 2 time occurrence, we object to any statement by probation that it was over a prolonged period of time. The court heard the evidence. I don't think the government would even contest this. It was exactly a 2 time occurrence. It involved conduct that we're not suggesting does not satisfy the elements of the inducement count, but it was a matter of touching rather than penetration or sexual assault as we understand it legally. So I wanted that to be clear, that there seems to be a generalization when it comes to describing these events. So I did put that in my memorandum. I don't think I need to belabor the point. So probation's characterization of the conduct as to Nia and the recommendation we do object to. Judge, okay, specifically, can you point out in the PSI that paragraph or the point so that I'll know precisely what you're talking about? Bonjean, yes, Judge. In page 2 of the recommendation, it's actually in the recommendation. Judge, what page is that on? Bonjean, page 2. It's about 2/3 down. Judge, wait a minute. I'm not following you. I'm talking about the PSI of Mr. Alper. Bonjean, right. And I was referring to his recommendation, Your Honor, where he, Judge, the recommendation. Okay, yeah. Bonjean, yes. Judge, okay, I'm not specifically talking about his recommendation. That is his recommendation, his view, and so forth, which I either can accept, not accept, or whatever. So I'm talking about the actual PSI, which will follow him. And if there are any inaccuracies in that document, if you want to call my attention to them, I will consider whether having them changed or leave them alone, depending on the situation. Is there any specific fact that is set forth in the actual PSI dated January 18th of this year? Banjin: Yes, Your Honor, and I think it does go to the guidelines, but we object to the criminal history category that he attributed to Mr. Kelly based on this 1996 incident. Judge: I think the government does not agree with the PSI on that. Is that correct? Appington: That's correct, Your Honor. Judge: So we will remove that. Banjin: Thank you, Your Honor. There were a couple paragraphs. Paragraph 125 in the PSR, for instance. Judge: Okay, let me get to it. Hold on. Banjin: Sure. Judge: 125? Okay, I'm there. Teresa? Banjin: Well, probation says defendant's contact frequency with Bruce. Do you see that sentence, Your Honor? Judge: Hold on. So then there was a brief pause, and then the judge finally responds and says, okay, what is the objection of what's the inaccuracy, alleged inaccuracy? Banjin: Yes, the suggestion is that somehow he had said something different to the Eastern District Probation Department, and I wanted to clarify for the court to the extent that this is suggesting that somehow he has misled the probation department here, is that his relationship with Bruce was non-existent for the most part up until his Eastern District case. They did reconnect in and around the time that he was facing sentencing in the Eastern District. So there is no real inconsistency there. It's just that what he told probation in the Eastern District was correct at the time. But his relationship with Bruce they did reconnect after the Eastern District of New York case. So minor point, but I just wanted to make it clear that, all right. Banjin, there wasn't an, she finished her sentence. There wasn't an inconsistency there. And then the judge says, all right, again, I would note that for the record. Anything else? And then Banjin continues, Your Honor, the probation report rips a great deal of, I guess, conduct from the Eastern District PSR, and there are objections we have to that conduct that were placed in writing and presented to the probation department. Again, this is conduct that is set out in the defendant's criminal history, though. And the reality is Mr. Kelly is going to be allotted 3 criminal history points for that conduct, I think, irrespective of what is summarized there. So again, to the extent that there's any inconsistencies there, I think it's not necessarily going to feature into this court's ultimate determination here. It appears in the criminal history section. And so then the judge cuts her off. I understand. I did review that. It's a summary of, I guess I'm not precisely sure where the summary came from, whether it came from the Eastern District PSI or Mr. Alper, whether is Mr. Alper here? Mr. Alper speaks up. Yes, Your Honor. Michael Alper, U.S. Probation. Judge, the information on the Eastern District case, did that come from the probation department there? Alper, that's correct, Judge. So it's not your specific findings. You just repeated what was in the PSI. Alper, that's correct. That's summarized from the PSR, where I believe in that case they wrote a 30 to 40 page summary of the offense. Judge, okay. Alper, and I narrowed it down for this case. Judge, okay. Well, I'll let the record disclose that it's not our probation officer. That's not his specific findings or conclusions. He just repeated what he understands the Eastern District of New York probation office was. Okay? Banjin, yes. Thank you, Your Honor. Judge, anything else? Banjin, no, Your Honor. Judge, okay. Okay, now if they're supposed to be doing the report for the case that was held in Chicago, or in the Eastern District, Northern District of Illinois, I'm sorry. Why are they copying the PSR report from the Eastern District of New York case? Like, that makes absolutely no sense, and that's why they have inaccurate information in the report. But we shall carry on. So the judge says, okay, Mr. Kelly, have you read the pre-sentence report, or have you had it read to you? Mr. Kelly, Your Honor, I've gone over it with my attorney. Judge, you have gone over it? Kelly, yes. Judge, is that correct? Is there anything else that you would like to point out to the court that you consider improper or wrong that your attorney has not just told me about? Kelly, I'm just relying on my attorney for that, Your Honor. Judge, okay, so you're relying upon what Ms. Bongine has just told me, and you adopt that. Is that correct? Kelly, yes, sir. Judge, is the government satisfied with the PSI? Ms. Appington, yes, Your Honor. Given Your Honor's note that the government disagrees with the 1 point that's assigned in paragraph 94, and that's carried out through 97 and then 177 because those numbers carry over into the criminal history calculation, which is in paragraph 97, and then the guidelines range, which is calculated in 177. So I know all of that sounds confusing, you guys, but what they're talking about is the pre-sentencing report, and the pre-sentencing report is sealed. But it's a pretty long document because I think in the Eastern District of New York case, I did do a video, I believe, on the pre-sentencing report, and it is like a really long document. But the last time I checked for this one, it was sealed. But that's what they're talking about. So she's saying paragraph 97 and paragraph 177. That's how they're referring to the information that they're now discussing in court. So then the judge responds, I'm not sure I understand what... Let me read what you just said. So then there was a brief pause, and then the judge picks back up and says, 94, yeah. The government has no specific information on that. That's my understanding. So the government isn't suggesting that occurred or didn't occur. Is that correct? And then Abington said, it's the government's position that the points shouldn't be assigned because we can't determine the disposition. So what they are talking about is his criminal history. The probation report included something that happened in Louisiana back in 1996 or something like that. And whatever happened, it was, what do they call it, where you come to terms with something and then they seal the record. So it was a situation like that, and the record has been expunged. So they don't even know what the incident was, and it wasn't a criminal incident, it was a civil incident. But I guess Mr. Kelly and whoever the person was involved, they came to an agreement. Whatever happened, whatever terms were fulfilled, and so the record was sealed. And then after so many years, the record was expunged. I mean, it was deleted. It doesn't exist anymore. And so they're saying that the government cannot include that in his probation score or sentencing score because they have no way of reviewing the record because technically the record no longer exists. So the judge says, all right, anything else? And then Abington says, no, Your Honor, just that paragraph 97 and 177, those paragraphs incorporate that 1 point. And then the judge says, oh, yeah, I'm going to find that it's criminal history category 2, and we're not assigning a point for that. He gets 3 criminal history points based on the New York decision, correct? All right, the guideline calculations are essentially agreed to, with the exception of the guideline calculation for counts 9, 10, and 12, was it? And then Bongine agrees that's right. And then the judge says, and Ms. Bongine objects to the probation officer's conclusion that the convictions in 9, 10, and 12 trigger 2A3.1 of the guidelines, which is a fear of bodily harm. The defendant's position, as I understand it, is that based on the government's proof in the case that Mr. Kelly groomed the victims by the use of affection, gifts, use of his star power, and his offer to help and so forth, that he did not coerce or use fear or bodily harm, but he used what I believe the expert witness of the government indicates what's been commonly referred to as grooming, which I understand meaning that you entice rather than coerce. Did I summarize the positions? Banjin, yes, you did. Judge, the government believes that fear of bodily harm is broad enough to include this case. Is that correct? And then Mr. Williamson, who I don't even remember being at the trial, but I remember him being added to the case, but I don't remember him ever speaking or questioning anybody. But he finally gets to say something. And he says, yes, Your Honor, and that it's not necessarily fear of bodily harm, but a broader concept of fear. So the judge says, but it does require, the statute, the one item in the statute that would govern would be coerce, correct? And then Mr. Williamson, coercion is defined as any kind of threat or of fear-inducing coercion, Your Honor. The judge, yeah, I looked in the Black's Law Dictionary. It says to compel by force or threat. I think Ms. Banjin is correct that the evidence does not show that there was a fear of bodily harm. There may have been a fear that she would be cut off and isolated and things of that nature, but the whole theory of grooming, which the government tried this case on, which included the expert witness, was sort of the opposite of fear of bodily harm. It was the fear of loss of love, loss of affection, and that sort of thing. And it just doesn't seem to me that that arises to the fear of bodily harm. Do you want to add any response? I don't want to put words in Ms. Banjin. Did I summarize your position? Banjin, yes, that's correct, Your Honor. And I would just point out that I think the evidence, first of all, the government did not pursue that theory really at all if you look at their closing argument. If you look at, also, the court may recall the jury's note regarding the disjunction versus conjunction, I think, and their concern, I should say their question about whether they had to find persuasion, inducement, and coercion, and they wanted to know whether they had to find all. And you guys remember I pointed that out in the last video that I did on the sentencing, that when the jury came back and they were talking about whether they had to use and, meaning all 4 or 5 words had to have happened, or they could use the word or, which means that it could be less than the 5 words. It could be just one thing. And so in the indictment, they used the word and then during the jury deliberations, they allowed the jury to change and to or, meaning that they only had to prove that one of those things was true. And so had the judge not allowed them to change and to or and left it as and, he would have been found not guilty on all the charges. But as it turned out, he was found guilty on 6 of the 13 charges. And it all came down to that one word that they changed, is when they changed and to or. So she goes on to say, I think we have a lot of indicators that at no point was there evidence presented of coercion or any type of threat or anything to overcome the victim's will. They have a lot to argue about the tactics of Mr. Kelly, but fear of bodily harm or fear of any sort of threats that would overcome their will is not among them. And that's just how the evidence came in. That's the theory they went on. So yes, I think you summarized it correctly, and I have nothing further to add about that. And then here comes Williamson. Your Honor, the government will point the court to case law setting out that this concept of fear can incorporate inferences from the circumstances, including the power disparity, especially in circumstances involving adults abusing young people, and that a fear of bodily harm is implicit in those types of relationships. We would also point you to the testimony at trial where Rashona testified directly that she was intimidated into acts with Kelly, and intimidation is naturally a state of fear. Pauline testified how she was concerned that Kelly might tell secrets to her mother, and that was what coerced her into engaging in sex with Kelly. And Mya told law enforcement that she felt compelled to engage in sex acts with Kelly because if she didn't do what Kelly said, she would lose the relationship with her. Well, she never had a relationship with him. That was the whole problem. But anyway, and this is all within the concept of the implicit fear that is established, including fear of bodily harm in a relationship between an abusive relationship between an adult and these individuals. The judge. Well, the one thing that's absent in the case was bodily harm actually done. As far as I can recall from the testimony, there never was any specific threat that he was going to. Now, he harmed her, obviously, but it wasn't the threat of bodily, the indignation and that sort of thing. So I'm going to find that we're not going to enhance that. I believe, therefore, that the actual offense level would be 32 and criminal history category 2. Is that correct? Bonjean, yes, Your Honor. Williamson, Your Honor, we set forth an alternative calculation that would result in an offense level of 33 based on the application of a separate subsection of 2G1.1 that would apply if the offense involved the production of a visual depiction of the abuse, and that would apply to Rashona and Pauline, who both testified at trial that Kelly set up video recordings of his instances of abuse. Then the judge says, what was the, and then Williamson, yeah, so starting in 2G1.1, and what he's reading with those codes is the United States Sentencing Guidelines, which is a document that helps them calculate the total score for sentencing purposes. So he says, if you look at subsection C1, that references a cross-reference to 2G2.1, which would set out a base level of 27, and then an increase of 2 levels for the age of the victims, but that would only apply to 2 of the victims, Rashona and Pauline, and not Mya. Judge, would that affect the overall guidelines then? Williamson, yes, it would. So a level of 33 with a criminal history category of 2 would result in the advisory sentencing range of 151 to 188 months. The judge, Ms. Bonjean, yes, Judge, yes. They made that argument in a footnote, and it is less applicable. It's entirely inapplicable. The judge, well, where is the footnote? Then Williamson, Your Honor, it's page 19 of the government's memo. Judge, okay. Williamson, yeah, it's footnote 4 starting on page 17 and footnote 5 starting on page 19. So there was a brief pause in the hearing. Then the judge said, I'm trying to figure this out. Can you help me a little bit again, explaining your... And then Williamson, yes, Your Honor. So the subsection C1 of section 2G1.1 discusses if the offense involved causing a person of less than 18 engage in explicit conduct for the purpose of producing a visual depiction. That invokes the cross-reference at section 2G2.1, which would result in a base level of 27. So then the judge says, Ms. Bonjean, and then she replies, yes, Judge. The only witness who discussed or testified about visual images being produced is Rashona. And our position is Mr. Kelly is being punished for those 3 counts of producing CP. Now, the government wants to now use the same conduct to enhance the enticement count as to Rashona for creating the CP that he is being punished for already in the other 3 counts, which would be multiple punishment. This is a trafficking type of enhancement. This is for people who transport over state lines for the purpose, and that's the language, for the purpose of creating CP. Mr. Kelly's offenses are not trafficking offenses. In fact, by definition, under the United States Sentencing Guidelines, they are not trafficking offenses. They may be offenses. So I am not trying to suggest that they're not serious offenses, but they're not trafficking offenses. Pauline merely testified, yes, I saw video equipment in the house. She never testified she's ever seen a video of herself. She never testified that she saw him video her. There's no evidence that there was ever a video made of Pauline whatsoever. This is just an assumption on the part of the government The evidence didn't establish that. They could have asked Pauline that question, but they didn't. And she never testified to that. At best, she said, I saw the presence of recording equipment. So, and again, we also have the problem with Mr. Kelly didn't transport anyone anywhere. This was not for the purpose of creating CP, and this enhancement is completely inapplicable. Other than Rishona, there's simply no evidence. We didn't see any video, and there was no testimony about other videos. So the government, and that's why they relegated this theory to a footnote, and that's where it should stay. It's not applicable. Then the judge said, well, all right then, anything further? So then here come Williamson. Yes, Your Honor. 2 points there. So there are statements from Pauline in the grand jury and Lisa Van Allen that they testified as to how Kelly video recorded them. And in our footnote 4, we have citations to both of those statements. So then the judge said, yeah, but that did not appear in the trial though. Not them thinking that just because they put something in the notes that I guess becomes testimony and should be used at the sentencing. So these people are crazy. So he replies, yes, Your Honor, but at sentencing that can be considered. And legally speaking, Your Honor, has ruled about 3 times now that there need not be the sole purpose of producing CP to invoke these types of provisions. Bonjean, but he's being punished for that already, Your Honor. And then the judge said, okay. I would not increase that. I will make a finding that we have 32 offense level criminal history to 135 to 168 months. So the government may proceed to address me as to the appropriate sentence. Appington, yes, Your Honor. If we could understand from the court when the victim impact statements will be read, if Your Honor wants to hear that now or at the conclusion. So the judge, well, whenever you want, well, probably now. We might as well have those now. So Appington, yes, Your Honor. Judge, you're going to read them or Appington? Your Honor, they will be read by 2 victims and a representative of one of the victims. Judge, all right. So Appington, Your Honor, first a representative for Rishona. Judge, yes, sir. So this is Mr. Brown, and Mr. Brown is Christopher Brown. He was the attorney that represented Rishona and her family, and then he was the one that then charged up $54,000 for his services to get restitution, and Bonjean had to tell them that it was not up to Rishona to be seeking restitution or putting together a case for restitution, that is for the government to do. And basically what Rishona was trying to do was avoid going to a civil trial, filing a civil lawsuit against Mr. Kelly. She was trying to present this to the judge so that he would give her what any other person would have sued for in civil court, and Bonjean was not having it. So Brown gets up and he says, yes, good morning, Your Honor. My name is attorney Christopher Brown, and I'm representative of Rishona Landfair. I'm going to read the prepared statement that my client provided to me. And then he begins, as I reflect on the thought of preparing this statement, my hands begin to shake and my heart pounds in my chest. Just writing this is stressful. When I think of all that I have lost due to Robert Kelly, all I can do is cry. I have lost my dignity due to Robert Kelly. I have lost my dreams due to him. I have lost my teenage years. I have lost my father. And I almost lost my entire family due to thoughts, she used the S word, thoughts, caused by him. I would never get back what Robert took from me. As a teenager, I wanted to be a star. Music was my life, and I loved performing. I really believed I had a future as a recording artist. I never thought that my first love, music, would lead to the darkness that I experienced for over a decade and almost killed me. When your virginity is taken by, and she used the P word, at the age of 14 and you live for him, your life is never your own. I don't know how Robert was able to obtain so much power over me. At first, I believed he could help me in my music career, child, didn't they all? And that he cared about me. That could not have been more wrong. During my years, I had sex with Robert hundreds of times, even when I didn't want to. It is still disturbing to me that millions of people have seen the tape that Robert made of me. I will never be able to unsee, unthink, or be unaffected by the CP in which I was enticed to engage in. I thought Robert loved me. To do the things he did, he in fact loathed me. I can't imagine treating anyone that I love the way that Robert treated me. Looking back at it, I was only one of the women to be abused by Robert. I didn't realize until I graduated from high school that I didn't make music for years while Robert was in my life. And that was the main reason I began to associate with Robert. Well, at least she being honest that she only was there because she wanted to be a star. Didn't they all, child? Her and Azriel, and I'm being serious here, her and Azriel need to partner up and do a reality TV show, okay? It might help a whole lot of other people that think that this is the route to go for your music career. And that's what I think. I mean, neither one of them getting any money out of this case, so they might as well go try and make some money elsewhere. So she continues and says, Robert was abusive and dominating. The rules that I was forced to follow for years because I believed I needed Robert were degrading. Sometimes I couldn't eat for days. Sometimes I couldn't go to the bathroom without his permission, child. Now she really sounds like what's that crazy Geronda Pace now? And I think this was Geronda's testimony she copying here. So sometimes I had to go to the bathroom in a bucket. Sometimes I had to have sex with women. It's hard to believe that Robert had that much power over me. Robert knowingly victimized me as a child. I was brainwashed by Robert and a sex slave. He had no remorse, and history was shown that there were women after me who suffered the same fate. Robert made me the S word as a young adult, like where you take, SUI word, okay? It is awful being me. I gave up my family for him. Nothing else mattered back then, and I still don't know why I love music. But by the time I was 16, 17 years of age, the only thing that mattered was him. I was manipulated, and independence didn't seem like an option. Robert shattered me. I need closure, and I need Robert in jail for as long as the law would allow. He shouldn't be able to harm anyone ever again. I wish I was strong enough to speak up sooner. I just didn't have the strength. I have been permanently scarred by Robert emotionally, physically, mentally, and socially. I will forever be the girl that R. Kelly peed on. Every time I walk into a room, it feels like the CP tapes arrive a couple of minutes before I do. I am rarely seen. The tapes have predetermined the attraction that I have with society. I keep a small circle because Robert has proved to me that I can't trust many people. I am 38 years old and learned through the lens of a P word. I have never had a loving romantic relationship with a man that lasted longer than a year. I have been bullied on social media and looked upon as the problem because I was victimized as the child. In what world does that make sense? Despite all the things that Robert did to me, today members of his team and those that support him still attack me. There's documented tapes establishing the horrible experiences that is actually my life. The public sees CP. The world does not see the depression and the thoughts in my mind that would give anyone pause that I would ever lead a normal life. I have never been able to experience normal. My teenage years and adulthood have been built through the lens of, and she keep using the P word, y'all. It is awful living life not knowing that you can't trust yourself because you are unaware exactly how fractured and broken you are. No amount of therapy will make me normal. The best I can hope for is to properly function and deal with the brokenness that is my life. Is that fair? But if you ask Robert's team, I am the problem. I am deceitful. I am the liar. Let me be clear, Robert is no saint. Does anyone really believe that Robert is not in these CP tapes? Does anyone believe Robert did not entice me and entice a young person and destroy her life? Does anyone believe that happened to me or what happened to me was okay? I think the answer is no, But if I was to listen to Robert's team, I would be the 14-year-old again, being enticed to continue down a socially destructive path, and the P will still be in control of my life. I made the decision some years ago to take control of my broken life. It is extremely hard, but it's the only life I have. I make decisions in my own time frame. I try to review all the possible results with as much certainty as possible before I decide what to do. It only seems right. I try to be more methodical because following passion for my first love, music, broke me beyond repair. Another mistake like that will kill me. Robert is not worth dying over. I cannot escape the psychological prison Robert has put me in. Robert needs to be in jail for the balance of his natural-born life. Thank you, Your Honor. And then the judge says, thank you. And then Appington, Your Honor, Nia will be heard next. So the judge said, fine, good morning. And then Nia said, good morning. I was 15 years old when I met you. I saw you from across the mall. I was so excited. You were one of my favorite singers. My heart felt like I was going to explode the closer I got to you. I could not believe you were there. How lucky I felt. Like a starstruck teenager, I ran over to you. I felt giddy and full of joy, and I was visibly nervous. I asked you for your autograph, but you gave me your phone number and a lifetime full of self-doubt, embarrassment, and rejected sense of self-worth. When I met you, I was a pleasant-faced, skinny, shapeless teenager who was mostly undeveloped and looked much younger than my age. I think she left the word was out. I was very anxious and a nervous child. I wasn't shapely like my peers, and I often got teased for my unflattering, skinny appearance. There was no mistake, I looked like a child. Within minutes after meeting you, you invited me and my friend to your concert that night. I was over the moon happy. For once in my lifetime, someone other than my family thought that I was special. I wanted to scream out loud, Kelly thinks I'm special. I'm not just plain or insignificant or invisible. He picked me. He wants me. I desperately wanted to go to the concert, but my friend refused to go. The next day, I built up enough courage to call and apologize for not making it. I fully expected that you would not answer your phone, but you did answer, and my heart dropped to the bottom of my toes. The conversation was brief, but you were kind and you seemed interested in talking to me again. I hung up the phone and my heart began to flutter. While my head filled with childish dreams of you and me being together, we spoke a few more times on the phone. Each time I could feel myself falling deeper and deeper. I knew nothing about love, romance, or how to please a man. I only knew that I did not want to disappoint you. I came from a single family, single mother home, and my mom did the best she could by raising us, but she was not rich, and she had to work long hours and sometimes night shifts just to be able to make ends meet. I'm sure it was easy to see that my family struggled financially, and at this time I would have done anything to maintain his attention, including lying to my mother. To this day, I still regret. Eventually, Rob invited me to his Minnesota concert. And let me put a P in here, child. Why? There's no record of this Atlanta concert or this Minnesota concert that she claimed she met him in Atlanta and she flew to Minnesota for this concert. People are saying that the year that she's claiming all this happened, he did not have concerts in either one of these cities. So I need to go back over the transcripts to see if Bonjean pointed that out during the testimony, because it just seemed like they were allowing people to just get up there and tell stories and not point to the facts. Because remember, Bonjean was very hard on Tracy, the Tracy chick. I can't think. I see her. Tracy Sampson was very clear in pointing out that she lied about the year that she met him, and therefore she lied about her age at the time. So I need to go back and read over Nia's testimony to see if Bunjin pointed that out as well, that the year she's claiming all this happened, Mr. Kelly was in neither of those places at that time. So she goes on to say, when the limo pulled up at my home, I felt like I was Cinderella going to the ball. After the concert, I went back to the hotel and waited for you. I was hungry. I did not have any money. I didn't know about room service. I kept telling myself that I need to just stay calm and not panic like a child. I eventually fell asleep telling myself that you must have been very busy. The next morning when you came to my hotel room, you requested I remove my clothes and walk. Okay, well, this Faith Rogers testimony here, wait a minute, ain't this what Faith said he made her do when he came to that room? Then you know what? I'm done. So, child, she said, I awkwardly did what I was told to do. You had me to lay on the bed while you molested me and pleased yourself. Same thing Faith said. After you put your clothes back on and left without saying a word. Same thing Faith said. I met you again, this time in Chicago at your recording studio. And you told me to come alone, but I disobeyed and brought my cousins. Once again, you got me alone and you groped me and sent me on my way. I felt used. I felt rejected in every way imaginable. And the next time we saw each other, I was a woman. I was a talent in one of your videos. I had grown into my long, lanky body and was no longer awkward. But regardless of how beautiful I may have been on the outside, I was completely damaged by you on the inside. Girl, if you was that damaged, why would you go and apply to be in one of his music videos? You looked at me as if you could recognize me, but you acted as if I disgusted you and looked away. This emotional pain lingered in me all the way up until the day I testified against you in court. It was like a light turned on, and I could finally see you for who you are. You were disgusted by me, not because I did something wrong, but because I grew up into a woman. I no longer looked like a child, but a mature, curvy woman, and you were only interested in children. Robert, for years you made me feel like there was something wrong with me. Now you are here in this courtroom in front of this judge because there is something wrong with you. No longer will you be able to harm anyone's children. No longer will you be able to go to shopping malls and pick up a child for the night. I'm not a revengeful or hateful person, but I highly suggest you spend every day in jail praying to God and asking him for forgiveness. No child should have to suffer self-hate like the way you made me suffer. I felt used. I felt worthless. I felt foolish. For the next 20 years of my life, I would wonder what I did wrong and why I wasn't good enough for you. Now, girl, let's start with the fact that man was in the mall minding his business. Didn't even know you existed. You approached him, okay? And then you called him about the concert. Then you flew yourself to Minnesota, which I don't even know how, if you were the age that you claim you were, I don't even know how you bought a plane ticket and got on the plane without an adult accompanying you. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. And then you went to Chicago for the summer, stalking this man, trying to hook up with this man. So, I don't know. Okay, well, anyway, the judge said thank you for her statement. And then Miss Appington said, thank you, Your Honor. You'll hear from Pauline next. So then Pauline gets up. Now, Pauline is a hair stylist in Chicago. And I know I keep telling y'all I am going to look this girl name up, but it's something like Shamir or Shalimar or something like that. I can't remember her name. But she definitely has a hair salon in Chicago. So Pauline says, good morning. The judge says, good morning. And then Pauline says, I have once loved Robert for many, many years. We had a solid friendship, I thought. I was going to conquer the world with him. Funny, I did not such things. Yes, she said not. I didn't misread that. Okay. So she says, I am here today just seeking restitution for years 2008 through 2014 for seeing my therapist. My insurance covered a few appointments, but not all. I was going through therapy twice a month and they only covered 4 visits. How great is insurance? I thank Thrive because they have helped me during some of the darkest places in my life. West Valley helped me a lot during the time I lived in Los Angeles. All I would like, either Los Angeles or Louisiana, she got LA in here. All I would like is for continuing mental health help. I stopped working for years because I felt less than. When I had my son, I was actually super healthy, no complications during my pregnancy, and I had a strong delivery. However, I could not handle the thought of being away from my child, the things that could happen at a school or daycare facility. He was too young to talk. My life is hard when all you think about is someone possibly harming your child because the things that has happened to you. I felt as though I was doing, Ooh, okay, I've been reading for 50 minutes, y'all. I was doing well with my life, learning to cope with things as much as I could. I had started teaching because I wanted to make a difference for other children. I would call myself the child whisperer because I refused to let any child get left behind. I was making over $50,000 a year. When I was so emotionally not in a good place, I had to stop working. I really needed to stop working because I refused to go back into the dark place I was once at. Blood, sweat, and tears, day by day, I crawled myself out of that depression, and I learned that no one could take that away from me. All I want in life is to feel a little less stress. I enjoy spending time with my family. My family is my entire world. I don't think without them I would be standing here today. I have had those dark thoughts of suicide. I have had those dark thoughts of nobody loving me. Let's just say this, Your Honor. You know what? I need to mark that timestamp so I can take the S word out of there. Okay, I had those dark thoughts of nobody loving me. Let's just say this, Your Honor. I do not know what I would do without my current husband. I never even thought that would be a possibility for somebody like me, to be able to be married or even if I deserve to be a wife. Because of the past trauma that I experienced with Rob and the way he played me online for years, I didn't think that I could be right for anyone else besides him. Trust me, that's not a good conversation piece when trying to date. People just simply jump to conclusions and think bad stuff about you before they even know anything about you. I've lived with this secret for years. I could never open up to a person. I've always held back my harsh realities, not feeling worthy, not feeling good about myself, feeling just overall gross. I had reached a place in my life that I was determined to finally live, to finally thrive. I was determined to not let my past determine my future. I would no longer play victim, and I would just take ownership of being a victim. So I told myself that the next person that God allowed me to meet, which was my husband, I would give him the true version of myself. Regardless of what he thought of me, at least it would be. I would be finally Pauline living in her truth. And guess what? He actually loved me. He loved my honesty. He loved my realness. And it was a lot for him to take at one time. But he helped me to go to therapy starting back in 2015 that he paid for out of his pocket. That's how I knew that it was real. He knew I wasn't okay and that we needed couples therapy if we were going to make this thing work. I am truly blessed and grateful because not everyone that came out of this situation has been blessed to find love. I have lost so much due to this. My best friend in the whole world, in the whole wide world, Rashona, we do not talk to this day because Robert pinned us against each other. Our children will never grow up together going to birthday parties, and that's something that money just can't buy. I can never get those years back with the person I felt was my bestest friend in the whole wide world. I've lost so many friends along the way due to their feelings regarding this case. I feel as though I've lived a double life my entire life, being that my family knows nothing what I was going through. That was not easy to deal with, dealing with mental health issues as well. My children can't even have regular childhood experiences like sleepovers because I refuse to allow my children to go into people's houses. I don't trust anyone with my children because I know firsthand where that can go. I just can't see how a person can sit and not feel any bad or remorse for his behavior. Meanwhile, he's just rich and living his best life while there's a lot of us out here suffering. I am trying my best to live a productive life to the best of my ability in this crazy world. I am mentally drained, but I do keep trying to keep it together and function on a daily basis because I look at my children and know that it is possible. It is possible to continue to push through anything you have gone through, and it does not have to be the end of the story. I simply am taking full control of my narrative, and I will change it every day, step by step. Thank you. So the judge said, thank you. Does the government wish to address me on the appropriate? And then Miss Appington jumped up. I'm starting to wonder. So you guys let me know. Is Pauline the one that's the hairstylist, or was that the girl who didn't show up and testify? That was the hairstylist, because I may be getting them mixed up because she was talking about working in childcare, but she never mentioned the fact that she owns a salon. So I'm wondering if that was the girl who didn't show up to the trial. Y'all let me know in the comments. So then it goes on and it says, does the government, now the girl who's the hairstylist, she does have children, because she did post her children on her Facebook page. Does the government wish to address me on the appropriate? And then Ms. Abington cut him off and says, yes, Your Honor. Your Honor, then the judge said, proceed, counsel. Then Abington says, based on the 3553A factors, a significant sentence is warranted in this case. A sentence of 300 months. Now, girl, how you can get all the way up to 300 months? And yes, that sentence must run consecutive to the sentence he has received in New York. A significant sentence, one that is sufficient but not greater than necessary, is a sentence that would effectively confine the defendant to prison for the rest of his life. There are three things that anchor the government's request. The seriousness of defendant's conduct. That is the absolute depravity of preying on children to meet his desires. Now, they ain't brought a child up there yet. But anyway, the adequate deterrence and protection for the public, because defendant for decades has been abusing people intentionally and with willful disregard, meaning he knew what he was doing was wrong and criminal and he did it anyway. And third, the need for the sentence imposed to reflect the seriousness of the offense, or in other words, justice for his victims. Now, the government is not going to reiterate our sentencing memo, but we will take this time to offer the court key takeaways from the sentencing memo which support an above guideline sentence. And child, I don't even think I'm going to read through all this here because I read that in another video. So first, the seriousness of defendant's conduct. The defendant inflicted deep wounds on three women, Rishona, Pauline, and Mya. You heard in their own words that they will never heal from their scars. At trial, Your Honor, heard each of these women relive the heinous things he did to them when they were child. She keep using the C words when these were clearly teenagers. But anyway, for the rest of their lives, they will have to live with feelings of distrust, victimhood, and worst of all, unwarranted shame for what he did to them when he should be the one expressing shame for what he did. But to this day, he refuses to show any shame, any remorse. What we have heard instead is turning the tables on the victims, blaming them for his conduct. The focus should be on the defendant's conduct. Your Honor, heard Rishona testify how he lured her into hundreds of encounters. And then the judge cut her off and said, let me ask you one question. You said blaming them for his conduct. And then she cut him off and said, yes, Your Honor. In the defendant's counsel's words in his sentencing memorandum, he pointed to Nia wanting to engage in the relationship with him because she wanted to get an autograph from him, and that describing Rishona's his abuse of Rishona as a relationship with him. Bonjean, I'll address this judge, but, and then Appington said, Your Honor, can I finish? And then the judge said, go ahead. And then she said, can I finish? Thank you. Your Honor heard Rishona testify how he lured her into hundreds of encounters, how he gave her alcohol and showed her porn, how at nearly 30 years old he took her the word when she was 15. Now, child, y'all just keep changing the ages here. How he used her to lure other people to engage in threesomes. These young women were engaging in threesomes with a grown man, child. It was acting grown, but anyway. And perhaps worst of all, videos 1, 2, and 3 show how he used Rishona as a prop, as a thing for his videos that he directed and recorded, forever memorializing his abuse. And video 1, which has been widely circulated and in a horrible way has become part of the social record, is something that Rishona will have hanging over her head for the rest of her life, as you heard in her statement. And Your Honor, you could not tell the story of Rishona without also talking about the obstructive conduct that he engaged in to save himself from prosecution. You heard Rishona testify how he lied in the grand jury, how she lied for him in the grand jury back in 2002. Objection. And then that was Bonjean. And then Appington, that transcript, then Bonjean said, Rishona never testified before the grand jury. Appington, Your Honor, and then Bonjean finished and said jury. And then Appington, that transcript was, and then the judge said, well, then Appington said, I don't know what's going on here. Then the judge said, proceed. And then Appington said, an exhibit. And then the judge, I heard the trial, so go ahead. Then Appington, the transcript was an exhibit at the trial. She lied at Kelly's direction. And her parents, they lied about seeing their own daughter in that video because they were scared to go against his power, money, and influence. This obstructive conduct is exactly the type of conduct that warrants an enhanced sentence because it was designed to thwart any law enforcement efforts to hold him accountable for his abuse of Rishona. He made a mockery of justice to protect himself and his career. But now a jury has spoken, and now is the time for justice. And his sentence, in light of the 3553A factors, should reflect all of the conduct surrounding his criminal abuse of Rishona, including obstruction. Pauline also has emotional scars she's carried to this day from Kelly's manipulation and abuse of her. Kelly used her for acts hundreds of times and convinced her that it was their secret to be kept from everyone else. And you heard her tell you today the toll of keeping his secret, what that has exacted on her life. And Mya in the mall, as she said, excited to see a superstar, not knowing that her innocent request for an autograph would lead to her being alone with this man in a hotel room while he sat on a bed next to her. Or that it, and then she said and did the M word, okay? Or that it would lead to her being in a hallway of his studio where he's put his hands down her pants or her and up her shirt, fondling her. The defense in their papers make a point of emphasizing that Kelly's abuse of Mya was isolated, quote, and merely a two-time occurrence and did not involve anything more than touching. That's an attempt to minimize defendant's conduct. As you heard from Mya, one cannot quantify the trauma of abuse. Mya's trauma is real and lasting. The fact that it happened twice doesn't change the fact that she was a child. She was a teenager. She wasn't a child when it happened. And that to this day, she's dealing with the fallout of the way he manipulated her and shamed her. Standing alone, a sentence of 300 months appropriately accounts for the indescribable harm defendant has caused to Rishona, Pauline, and Mya. As to the adequate deterrence and protection from the public defendant's conduct, as shown in this case, is far from being a one-time mistake. Defendant's abuse of minors was intentional and prolific. He stands before you a 56-year-old man who has proven that he cannot control his impulses, and that even in the face of clear signs that his conduct is criminal, including obtaining false documentation to marry a 15-year-old and knowing that authorities were investigating allegations of his misconduct of Rishona, even in the face of those clear signs, he refused to control himself. Take, for example, how with careful deliberation in the videos he created, he fixed the camera on Rashona's face. And he also ensured that the camera caught his own face. This conduct speaks volume about his complete failure to grasp the gravity of the harm he was causing and how beyond the reach of the law he thought he was. A defendant that brazen demands a substantial and significant sentence in order to protect, promote respect for the law, and protect the public. Defendant's desire and interest in these individuals hasn't gone away. It is what he has been doing for most of his adult life and what makes him a danger to society. His refusal to accept responsibility for his actions that dates back to at least 2008 when he pressured Rashona and her parents to lie to a state grand jury. Now, girl, the grand jury was back in 2001, but anyway. And it continues to this day. The arguments advanced by his counsel in his sentencing papers deflect blame from defendant's conduct on everyone but him. His lack of acceptance of responsibility for his criminal conduct, even despite unassailable video evidence of that conduct, demonstrates that he poses a great risk to recidivism. Now, the government recognizes that before stardom, defendant had a difficult upbringing, including instability in the home, learning challenges, and the abuse he suffered as a child. Separately and combined, these circumstances present serious challenges. However, none of these mitigating factors overcome the aggravating factors in this case. The seriousness of the offense, the refusal to accept responsibility and lack of remorse, and the decades of conduct that demonstrate that he poses a great risk of recidivism and danger to the community. The reality is that defendant had multiple chances to break a harmful cycle that began with his own abuse, but instead he chose to perpetrate it. Defendant's unrelenting abuse of girls and women and his refusal to acknowledge his criminal conduct and the harm he has caused demonstrates that he cannot be deterred. And the only way to ensure he does not reoffend is to impose a sentence that will keep him in prison for the rest of his life. And finally, the need for the sentence imposed to reflect the seriousness of the offense, or, in other words, justice for defendant's victims. For all the reasons discussed today and set forth in the government's papers, the 3553A factors warrant a sentence of 300 months, and that sentence must run consecutive to the sentence in New York. It must be so for these victims to receive justice. Simply put, their harms are distinct from and different from those victims in the New York case. Substantial and incremental punishment is necessary in this case to account for his abuse of Rashona, Pauline, and Nia, who were not part of the New York case in any way. For all the then why are y'all using the testimony from those cases? Y'all had to show Nia and Rashona the testimony from Faith and Geronda in order for them to put them in their victim impact statements. I'm just saying. So for all the reasons in the government's papers, Kelly's sentence needs to reflect the seriousness of the lifelong harm he caused to Rashona. Then the judge cut her off and said, "Let me ask you, excuse me." And then Abington said, "Yes." And then the judge said, "Can I interrupt? One question. If they weren't, I appreciate that. And I appreciate it in two respects, that they weren't tried together, but they could have been tried together. It would have made a 1-month trial into a 2-month trial, but they could have been tried together though, correct?" And then Abington said, "Yes, Your Honor, they could have." And the judge said, "And you would have to have the sentence would not be any higher than 360 to life, correct?" And then Abington said, "If they were all tried together?" And then the judge said, "Yeah, if this case, our case, had been tried with New York, by the time you got through the guideline calculations, it would have cut off at 360 months to life. Wouldn't it?" And then Abington said the guidelines likely would have been life. And then Bonjean said it was. And then the judge said 360 months which is a lot less than 650 months. And then Appleton said, yes, Your Honor. However, the sentence that the New York court ultimately imposed, we don't know what that could have been or would have been given the increased harm. There's no, if you will, volume discount for the number of victims. And then the judge says, I understand that. Then Appleton says that then the judge cut her off again and said, but Judge Donnelly, did have an upward departure, correct? And then Abington said, I believe so, Your Honor. And then the judge said, I believe, I don't remember what. And then Abington said, no, Your Honor, I apologize. No, Your Honor. The guideline was 360 months to life, and I believe he received a within guideline range. And then the judge said she gave him, and then Abington said sentence, and then the judge said 360 months, and the guidelines were what, 250 to something? Anybody know? And then Abington said, hold on a second, Your Honor. And then the judge said, my only point, and I don't like to interrupt you, my only point was that if it had been tried together, the guideline, well, it would have been life, I guess, but, and then Abington said, they would have been life. And then the judge said, life is life, okay? Then Abington said, the point being is that you didn't, despite what the guidelines range may have been, the court gets to decide in that range and on that continuum. And then the judge said, yeah, it could have. I mean, I read somewhere that some judges have given 7,000 months to defendants that they thought were particularly bad, which just, I guess, to make a point. Go ahead. I'm sorry to interrupt you. And then Abington said, no, Your Honor. The point being is that even if these cases were, this case was, these particular victims were included in that case, it doesn't mean that his sentence would have been the same as it was in New York. There could have, and there should have rightly been an increase, substantial incremental increase for the harm. And then the judge said, the judge could have given a higher sentence than she actually did. I appreciate that. I'm just saying, but you're asking for 650 months. And then Abington said, we're asking for 300 months. And then the judge said, 300 plus the 350. And then Abington said, it would run consecutive to the New York sentence. And then the judge said, yeah, if we do that, then in effect, he's getting a sentence of 650 months, correct? My math is right, I'm sure. And then Abington said, yes, Your Honor. However, standing alone, his conduct is warranting of a 300-month sentence. And so, yes, Your Honor, considering that would run consecutive, that's the amount of time, yes, that he would be looking at. And then the judge says, I think I have your point. And then Abington said, yes, Your Honor. The consecutive sentence sends the message to the defendant and the public, and most importantly, the victims, that the incremental harm that he inflicted upon them is worthy of incremental punishment. The reality is that defendant put himself in this position. If he hadn't obstructed the initial prosecution by the state, or had learned from that experience to change his conduct, he would not have wound up in this position. And that is 2 cases and the prospect of consecutive sentences. The posture we are in now demands that the court's focus remain on ensuring that the sentence imposed here, standing on its own, sufficiently protects the public from the defendant's unrepented exploitation of individuals and provides justice to the victims he harmed by his actions in this case. And Your Honor can do that by imposing the 300-month sentence that the government is requesting, even partially consecutive to the sentence that is in New York. The crimes the defendant committed with respect to Roshana, Pauline, and Nia are deserving of a 300-month sentence on their own, and the law allows for such a sentence, and the current guidelines are an appropriate benchmark for which to guide the court. Again, under the 3553A factors, to see how a 300-month sentence is appropriate. For all the reasons discussed today and in the government's sentencing memorandum, the government is asking for a sentence of 300 months to run consecutive to defendant's sentence in New York. This type of sentence is sufficient but not greater than necessary to accomplish the goals of sentencing. Thank you, Your Honor. And then the judge said, thank you. And then he calls on Banjin. So Banjin says, thank you, Your Honor. Then there's a brief pause, and then Banjin picks up, thank you, Your Honor. The first category of information that this court will have to look at is, of course, the nature and circumstances of the offenses. It is wrong to suggest that Mr. Kelly, either Mr. Kelly individually or through his counsel, is any way engaging in victim blaming or attempting to even quarrel with the facts that the jury accepted in their sentencing memorandums. It is not reflected in our papers. The fact that we took a position that fear wasn't involved is not victim blaming. It is our argument about what enhancement should apply, what enhancements shouldn't apply, what the evidence actually showed, what the relationships really were. The court heard the testimony. As the court is aware, the relationship with Rishona, yes, we saw the videos. Not once in our sentencing papers, not once has anyone, even frankly through trial, said, that's not him, that's not her. We didn't do that. We did not do that, and we made a calculated choice. So this is not victim blaming. This is just an effort to suggest that Mr. Kelly is somehow not rehabilitated or not capable of rehabilitation because he likes remorse. So it's just not true. The court cannot identify a single sentence in our sentencing papers where we are saying the jury got this wrong or the jury got that wrong. We made those arguments. We accept that they were rejected. There may be a time to make those arguments in the appellate court if we think the sufficiency of the evidence was lacking. But for sentencing purposes, that is not what we have engaged in. This idea that he has failed to accept responsibility, now the government knows that's not true. And the government knows, and I don't like to bring this up, but the government knows why he had a trial. And it is not because Mr. Kelly was not willing to take responsibility for conduct that he was willing to take responsibility for, as opposed to acquitted conduct that the government continues to want to rely on to enhance his sentence. Now, it is no question that the counts related to Rishona are serious, but it is also undisputed that relationship was more complicated than the government wants to admit. The relationship with Pauline far more complicated than the government wants to admit. No one is suggesting that the proofs did not persuade a jury that he is guilty of those counts, and we accept the seriousness of those counts. But whenever you're speaking about seriousness of offense, it is on a continuum. The government has us looking at cases like the Osborne case as some type of comparison, where Osborne was trafficking children over Facebook and having sex with them and recording it and selling videos. This is not the same type of conduct. I'm not suggesting it minimizes Mr. Kelly's conduct. I'm saying that we still have to actually look at the conduct here. Mr. Kelly, again, there is no question that if the video was never made, it could never have made its way into the public sphere. We do not deny that. We said it. It is also the case that Mr. Kelly is not the person that put the video into the public sphere. If he had, I'm sure the government will be arguing that as a point of aggravation. Other people were responsible for that. Rishona's own aunt, as she testified to. And the point is not to minimize his conduct, but it is also to put it in context, because that is what we are permitted to do at sentencing. To say, yes, it's bad, but these are the ways in which it could have been worse. That is how we look at conduct. Now, you heard testimony about Kelly and Rishona's relationship that lasted all the way to 2019. Now, I am not suggesting that her statement here today is not valid or that she does not feel the way she does, but there was, and Pauline even said it today, there was more to that relationship. It started out as unlawful conduct, and it morphed into a relationship that even Pauline described today as a friendship. I thought we had something, and now in hindsight, I look back and I say, when I have my own kids, this was so wildly inappropriate. And of course, a jury found it illegal. We are not denying any of that. But to compare these to someone who is trafficking individuals that they've never met, taking videos of prohibited activity with these individuals and selling it all over the country as the government tries to compare this case to is not fair either. So we have to look at the specific conduct here. And yes, the court has an obligation to hold him responsible. The court has an obligation to put weight on that conduct and to fine, and we agree it's serious conduct, but it isn't what the government tells the court that it is. And Mya, it is a less serious count. I'm sorry, we're not trying to minimize it, but it is a less serious count. This was a 2-time encounter that the one he's charged for was a 2-minute interaction in the hallway, which again, you can't even make these arguments without being accused of victim blaming, which is not quite fair. But let's be real, the conduct of touching and fondling Mya, who was 15 or 16, depending on when it happened that summer, in the hallway is not the same type of conduct even compared to Rishona. So I think we do need to continue to keep this in perspective. Yes, the court should look at the seriousness of the offense, but also realize and recognize that, and the court, I'm sure, has heard many cases that this is not akin to the type of conduct, for instance, that the government referenced in the Osborne case. Now, if the court will indulge me 1 second, and then she takes a brief pause. The government also, again, puts a lot of emphasis on this obstruction count, for which Mr. Kelly was acquitted. And the court heard from Rishona. The court heard from Rishona's mother. Again, because this was a complex relationship with the complicity of parents, frankly, that this wasn't Mr. Kelly's obstructing as much as a family deciding that they did not want to participate in the criminal justice process at the time. Now, when I asked Rishona's mother, are you saying that you did this, you didn't participate because Mr. Kelly was going to pay you money or something like that? She said no. Rishona herself said, I have my own reasons, and we understand that, and that doesn't take responsibility off of him, but it is not obstruction, which is why the jury didn't find obstruction. It's ironic that the prosecutor says, and the jury has spoken, yes, they did speak, they spoke, and he was acquitted of that conduct. One argument that the government continues to advance, which is just simply untrue, is that Mr. Kelly cannot control himself. I think Ms. Appington said his interest in young women has not gone away. Where's the proof? This is conduct from the late 90s. They have not identified a single case where that conduct continued after his acquittal, not one. So the judge says, well, that's not entirely true, because in the PSI, and again, I'm relying upon Mr. Alpert's summary of the New York case, there are several of the victims in New York, which was, I think one of them was as late as 2016. And then Bonjean says, yeah, but those weren't. And then Appington says, actually, Your Honor. And then Bonjean finished, minors, Your Honor. And then the judge says, no, and then Bonjean says, yeah. Then the judge says, I understand that. Then Bonjean says, okay. Then Appington says, Your Honor, there is a minor that was convicted for which the conduct he was convicted in the conduct with that minor occurred after the 2008 trial. She was 16, 17 when she met him, Geronda Pace. And then Bonjean says, that wasn't after. I'd be happy to address that, Your Honor. And then the judge said, all right. And then Bonjean says, there is, in the New York case, there is a 1990, I think 6 or 7. And then with this Geronda Pace testimony, this was prior, 2006, 2007, to his acquittal. Point being, wait, Geronda was after the acquittal. Bonjean, I need you to get it together here, girl. Okay, so point being, as if there was any conduct that post-dated the late 90s of producing CP, I think they would have brought that in this indictment or the other indictment. I'm not talking about, you're right, the court is correct, there were allegations about Kelly's conduct. And then the judge says, right, then Bonjean said that was, and then the judge says, yeah. And then she said prohibited, and the judge says that's basically what I meant. And then Bonjean says yes, and that's fair, and I'm not trying to mislead the court on that. So, okay, I'm glad you got that together, because, girl, I was raising my brow on you. So, but to say that he is a serial predator of minors and that he cannot learn and that he's still a risk, my point is that the evidence has shown that there has not in at least 2 decades been a crime committed as to minors. So that is just not fair, which again doesn't mean he can't be or shouldn't be punished for the conduct for which he's been convicted here. Now, I do want to talk a little bit about the history and characteristics of Mr. Kelly, because while on one hand, we all acknowledge the harm that abuse can cause, according to the victims, of course, it never goes away. It follows you for life. It impacts your life forever. I think one of them said, it changes your lens through how you look at everything, and it just never goes away. But for Mr. Kelly, apparently, he was supposed to overcome his abuse, and we can't even consider it as mitigation. There's a lot of lip service to it as being mitigation. Every prosecutor gives it one sentence, and then there's no additional really weight given to it. Well, mitigation is never an excuse. No one ever says it's an excuse for conduct. If it was, then it would be raised at trials and not at sentencing. But it does help the court weigh the evidence and also determine whether or not there are reasons for why people have made the decisions they have made and why they have gone about their lives in the way that they have. In Mr. Kelly's childhood, and they can say he should have overcome it, but according to their own witnesses, it's impossible to overcome except when it's Mr. Kelly. What we have here is an individual that had a horrific childhood that shaped him, that shaped his view of women, that shaped his view of sex, that shaped his view of the world. He was an 8-year-old when he started being abused as a child by not only a family member, but someone who groomed him. This abuse lasted for years. It included penetration. It included oral, anal, nonstop for years by a sister and by a neighbor. We'll call him a neighbor. Mr. Kelly also was forced to take pictures of his sister having relations with her cousin, who she eventually married. Oh, Lord Jesus. So I thought she was married to a preacher. So the preacher man is their cousin? Oh, ugh. Now, if that doesn't shape someone's worldview and life view, I don't know what would. Now, I don't bring this up to make excuses for his conduct, but I think you don't need to be a PhD to connect the dots here. And it is, in fact, a relevant point for mitigation. Mr. Kelly's adverse childhood experiences are linked to his negative outcomes in adulthood. That's what every expert says. Their own experts have said that. It's not simply as he chose not to overcome it. That's not how it works. They know it's not how it works. Now, he grew up also in extreme poverty and not only experienced his horrific childhood abuse himself, but witnessed violence in his home nonstop. It was so normalized that Mr. Kelly doesn't even consider it abnormal in a way. His mother, her husband violently fighting each other. In fact, in one instance, his mother, who he adores, I want to make that very clear, was fighting with her husband, and somehow her dress got caught in a door and he started driving away, a car door. And her children, watch as their mother's being dragged down the street. Jesus. This is the type of violence he grew up in. In fact, one time his mother accidentally stabbed him at the age of 16 because of some violence in the household. He was regularly disciplined with whips, switches, belts. This was normalized. And I want to make very clear, because he would be upset if I didn't, that didn't change his love for his mother. She did the very best she could, but this is generational trauma. Generational trauma. So you can't just say, oh, he just could have overcome it. Well, child, I guess that's why I thought he was spanking the folks over in the Eastern District of New York, because he hadn't watched, what was that movie, 50 Shades of Grey? But I guess it was something that was trauma from his childhood. Oh, child. So clearly, There was premature sexualization in his life. There was a household with no boundaries when it came to sex. He was being molested by the age of 7 or 8, asked to take photos. He has significant mitigation that at least helps explain conduct, not excuse but explain. And the law and the sentencing guidelines tell this court that is something that the court should take into account. We also know from Dr. Dietz' report that he was tested not too long ago, right before his Eastern District sentencing. He reads and writes at a 1st to 3rd grade level. Illiteracy followed him his entire life, and it shaped him too. It prevented him from surrounding himself with people that might have been able to get him help. People who took advantage of him, who exploited him in adulthood, and then he raises up to stardom as a young child with no experience in the world other than his horrific traumatic experience. And it is no wonder that who he was in the late 90s evolved from that experience. Now, I asked the court to consider the reports that we submitted. I'm not going to belabor them. They were lengthy. They were complete. They were corroborated by collateral sources, meaning there were outside individuals who corroborated the evidence, and there is significant mitigation in this case. And I don't care whether he's 50 some years old. These are adverse consequences that affect you through life, and that explains much of the conduct for which he was convicted here. And it is not accurate that through the last 20 years he has been abusing 14 or 15-year-olds. I'm not suggesting his relationships with women have not been, as the Eastern District jury found, inappropriate, illegal in some respects, but I think we need to differentiate. And we've heard that they use the P word again. I just want the record to be clear. There's no doctor, and he has been examined, that has ever said he is that. That is a medical term that requires interest. Oh, child, and they get a definition. Oh, so I'm not reading it because I done said it 100 times. So I just want to be clear, that doesn't make it any less illegal if someone's of a certain age, but it does not mean that someone is that word. Now, the mitigation is significant, and I now want to turn to the questions of this above guidelines range. I believe the statutory maximum for the top count is 20 years here. The government is they're really asking for a second life sentence, and it's unclear why. He only has one life to give, and it is not the case that victims are entitled to some number of years. Even a concurrent sentence acknowledges the harm that has occurred to the victims in this case. Now, for the court to impose a 300-month sentence, as the government requests, would require an extremely above guidelines range. Even probation does not recommend an above guidelines range in this case. And I believe their requests hinge on two factors. One, this lack of remorse. And again, I don't want to beat this horse, but it is not the case that Mr. Kelly has shown lack of remorse in either his papers or anywhere. In fact, the government knows we tried very hard for Mr. Kelly to accept responsibility for certain conduct, and they wanted the trial, not us. And this conduct the government asked of 300 months because of lack of remorse also infringes on his Fifth Amendment rights. Why? Mr. Kelly is still under indictment in Minnesota. He still has a serious, essentially life sentence in the Eastern District. I don't know what they want from Mr. Kelly. Do they want him to come up here, take responsibility, and then get indicted in other jurisdictions for that evidence to be used against him? On the advice of counsel, I have advised him, and he's going to follow my advice, that he will not allocute here. But he would like to. He would like to very much. Now, the other factor that the government asks this court to essentially give an above guidelines range is to just look at the current offense levels for the conduct Look at the current offense levels and consider those in determining an appropriate sentence here today. Well, that's the one thing this court knows it cannot do. That is an ex post facto violation. They are making an end run around that. Even the case they cite, and this is an important point, United States versus Coe, and it's a distinction that they have not recognized. But what Coe said is that when there's an aggravating element that was omitted as a sentencing factor in the applicable guidelines, a court can look at that aggravating element. Presumably, it's an element a court could consider as a sentencing factor anyway and say, okay, yes, it was later codified. I see this element as a basis to raise the sentencing guidelines or upwardly depart. Code does not permit a court to simply say, oh, we punished the crime harsher now, so just apply the guidelines now to apply an upward variance. Code does not say anything of the sort. This was about aggravating elements that a court might have considered anyway in a sentencing factor. What they're saying is, we just punish it more now. You should consider that. It's our position that that would be a clear ex post facto violation. I believe we addressed this in our responsive papers, asking this court to upwardly depart or apply an upward variance based on acquitted conduct, I think runs afoul of a number of constitutional violations. For one thing, for the court to do that, it would take the crime outside the statutory maximum and would run afoul of Apprendi. Not only did the jury get presented with the facts on obstruction, they acquitted him on that. So that cannot possibly be a basis to apply an upward variance. So the court's offense range that it articulated earlier, which I believe is 132 to 168 months. And then the judge said 135. And then Bonjean corrected herself and said 135 to 68, and then the judge said 268, and then Bonjean finished and said months is the applicable guideline range. There are not grounds for an upward variance, and we asked the court to reject the request from the government. And I, again, point out I didn't agree with a lot probation had to say, but that part I did agree with, that there's no grounds for an upward variance. The last thing I want to cover is the concurrent versus consecutive nature. The government concedes we didn't need to have this trial at all. This trial should have been brought in the Eastern District. Why? Because according to the government, the enterprise that Mr. Kelly purportedly engaged in included conduct that we heard here. That could have been raised here. I understand the government's point that this is not a clear double jeopardy problem, and I understand that the law would suggest that they had the right to do that. They could bring it in a different jurisdiction. But as a matter of fairness, due process, to ask now enhanced punishment because on consecutiveness is unfair and it is not justified. It is not warranted. The government points again to two factors that it wants this court to rely on in running the case consecutive. Again, we go back to his lack of remorse. I do not believe this court can find his lack of remorse as a grounds to run this case consecutive, particularly since Mr. Kelly is still under indictment and the court does not have any reason to believe he doesn't have remorse. He just is following his attorney's advice not to allocute, which frankly any attorney would give when someone is under pending indictment. Our papers have never suggested that he has not been convicted of serious offenses. So to say he lacks remorse is a red herring. It's not true. They're not in his head. They don't know what he feels, and they don't know what he would say if they stopped indicting him and he had the opportunity to allocute. The other grounds that they identify for running this case, the sentence here consecutive, is that there just should be substantial incremental punishment for these victims. What that suggests is that a concurrent sentence should not address the harms that these victims talked about, or, of course, a concurrent sentence would. In what world do we say that consecutive sentences is the only way to address the harms? He has a life sentence by all statistical measures. I think I cited it. You guys can tell I'm losing my voice. So African American men who have diabetes do not live into their 80s in prison. I mean, some do, but it is very much outside the statistical probabilities, and what they want is some type of symbolic sentence for themselves. That's what they want, and there is no justification for a consecutive sentence when he is already going to be serving what is tantamount to a life sentence. The victims are not in any way not recognized in this case because it's a concurrent sentence. Pauline, I think, mentioned he's out living his best life. He's in the MDC where he's going to be in prison until he dies, probably, based on the existent sentence. I don't know how that's living your best life, you know. So to suggest that he's not being punished is just absurd, frankly. He is and he will be punished based on the sentence that came down in the Eastern District. He will be punished here based on the court sentence, but running it consecutive is overkill. It is symbolic that the government wants that for some reason. Why? Because he's R. Kelly, that's why, and that is not fair. Now, I've made some remarks in my sentencing memorandums about where I think the government should spend their resources and time. But just because you give R. Kelly 50 years, 100 years, doesn't mean you have solved the problem of exploitation in this country. There's plenty of exploitation, but giving him a 100-year sentence, 200-year sentence, that doesn't solve the problem. This is still an individual, and a sentence needs to be appropriate for this individual, taking in this individual characteristics, and yes, looking at the conduct in this case, which we have gone through extensively. As far as deterrence goes, where the specific deterrence is not a factor. Why? He's already incapacitated. How does this specifically deter him? He's already got a 30-year sentence, and that sentence again will likely take him through the rest of his life. The general deterrence, as I argued, I think the public has a sense of how serious these offenses are. I think if anyone has provided general deterrence, it's R. Kelly. In fact, I think most people look and go, geez, Robert Kelly, man, he's got the longest sentence in the history for this type of conduct, particularly compared to his other counterparts that are similar to him in terms of his fame and wealth. And so I don't think that general deterrence is a problem. The public has been generally deterred already. In fact, if there's one person that no one wants to be on this planet, it's R. Kelly. So they have accomplished both specific deterrence and general deterrence. Running this sentence consecutive is not going to enhance that any further. So, Your Honor, I want to just reiterate, Mr. Kelly, myself on behalf of Mr. Kelly, we've never minimized the crimes for which he was convicted. We have simply argued that we think it's inappropriate sentence. We believe the guidelines range is appropriate under the circumstances and a concurrent sentence is appropriate. Again, this case could have been brought in the Eastern District, saved everybody a lot of time and resources, and Judge Donnelly could have factored in this additional harm. But our position is that the guideline range adequately responds to the conduct that Mr. Kelly has been convicted of. There's no need to go above. And there's no need to run this consecutive because it's frankly overkill. And the government hasn't really provided a strong argument for why it should be consecutive other than he has lack of remorse, which frankly our position is they cannot say. And it is not our position at all that he lacks remorse. So with that, Your Honor, unless the court has any questions, that concludes my remarks. Judge, I need to ask your client if he wishes to allocute. Mr. Kelly, would you like to make a statement on your own behalf before I impose sentence? Mr. Kelly, sorry, Your Honor, but no advice of my counsel, I would not. Judge, thank you. Mr. Kelly, thank you. Judge, any further from either side? Child Appington, nothing from the government, Your Honor. So the judge says, okay, what's interesting in this case is that this case was filed first and would have gone to trial first, but for the fact that the COVID protocols, because we had 3 defendants and because of distancing requirements, we couldn't try the case until this past fall, where the CDC reduced the distancing requirements from 6 feet to 2 feet. So the case went ahead in New York and there was a sentence imposed. And one of the questions in my mind that I've been thinking about a lot is, if the case had gone first here rather than New York, what kind of sentence would I have imposed under the facts as I understood them as the jury determined the case? The guidelines that we worked out, or that I have established at this particular time, is 135 to 168 months. So, of course, that is one of the starting points. That's not the ending point, of course, because we have to consider the nature and circumstances of the offenses and the history and characteristics of the defendant and the other factors that the purposes of sentencing that we know about that reflect the seriousness of the offense, promote respect for the law, provide just punishment, provide adequate deterrence, and protect the public. The sentence that I would have given probably would have been higher than the guidelines, probably because of some of the points that the government has indicated. I think that while the jury spoke on the issue of whether he had obstructed justice, there certainly was evidence that I could find by a preponderance that he obstructed justice, and also, as the government pointed out, that the later guidelines, which would be in current now, would provide for a higher offense level for the actual conduct. So I have not come to a complete sentence. But of course, the elephant in the room, so to speak, is what is he going to do as far as consecutive versus concurrent? And that is the issue that I'm going to start out with discussing. And then we'll end up with, because basically it's kind of irrelevant if what I end up sentencing him either way. So the question is, I'm not going to keep everybody in suspense. I am going to provide for a consecutive sentence, but a minimal consecutive sentence of 1 year to add to the New York sentence. But I want to go into the reasons for my thinking upon which I base my decision. First of all, we start out with the sentence that everybody knows, at least as far as the judges who get involved and the lawyers who are involved in sentencing. Sentencing is to be sufficient, but not greater than necessary. The purposes of sentencing, which I briefly had mentioned, reflect the seriousness of the offense, promote respect for the law, provide just punishment, provide adequate deterrence, and protect the public. Now, we start out. The seriousness of the offense is the nature and circumstances of the offense. And of course, everybody agrees that the nature of this offense is horrible, horrific. Abuse of young women, sex tapes, tapes being in the public and cannot be, even though Mr. Kelly's minions spent hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars trying to get these tapes back. And obviously they were not able to do so. And they're out there in the public and they can't be removed. The defendant's actions are seen on the tapes. The only possible ameliorating is that he didn't apparently intend to traffic the tapes. He certainly was horrendously negligent in how he kept them. As I remember, I think Lisa Van Allen said that she found them in, I guess, a backpack sitting on the floor. And so she just helped herself to them. And that started out a rather Keystone Cop kind of operation in which these tapes spread out through the country. And Kelly's minions spent hundreds of thousands of dollars in effort trying to get them back. They were obviously unable to do so. This was not prepubescent, okay, SCP, y'all figure that, okay, which is a particular type. And there is, and I understand it based upon Dr. Deet's report, that Mr. Kelly is not the P word. But again, these tapes got out there, and that's the nature and circumstances of the offense. And it's horrendous, and everybody agrees with that, and it's deserving of very, very serious consequence to Mr. Kelly. Now, the history and characteristics that both sides have gone into, Ms. Bonjean points out that he had a fatherless childhood and he was raised in poverty, alcoholism in the family. He was subject to what has been a nice euphemism, adverse childhood experiences, another word for abuse. He is marginally illiterate and he has a learning disability. His education is minimal. But contrast to that, he's a music genius, multiple Grammy Awards. He wrote music for himself and many other famous musicians. His song was featured in a movie with Michael Jordan. All of a sudden, here's a person working on the street, and all of a sudden he ends up with millions of dollars in cash without anybody really there to explain how he should handle himself. It is clear he wanted money, they said. You don't need a credit card. Here's some cash. Just take the cash, use it wherever you wanted to do it, giving him hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash. One of the things that occurred to me during the trial, and we found out when we got to the pre-sentence report, where was the IRS in all this with this money going out, this cash being coming out of the bank hand over fist. And we found out that I think there's a $10 million worth of IRS liens against him currently, according to the PSI. He did use some of the money for good. There is evidence that he gave money to many people who merely, some of the people didn't ask it. And then the final thing is that rather than being the P word, he's, according to the diagnosis, as I understood it, other specific paraphilic disorder, meaning he has a sex problem with controlling his sex, which is pretty obvious from the evidence in this particular case. So we have a case where it's always difficult when you impose a sentence because it's very easy to understand. One of the things that I think we should make very clear, that under the federal system we have truth in sentencing. It's unlike the state of Illinois where you get a day for good time. So that if you sentence somebody to 30 years, they're actually going to serve 15 unless they really misbehave. In the federal system, usually you get good time of around 10%. So a 30-year sentence would be approximately 27 years as opposed to 30. So we're not talking about no matter what I do, Mr. Kelly is not going out the door after today. He's not going out the door in the next 10 years. He's not going out the door in the next 20 years. And one of the things that we should bear in mind, he is 56 years old currently, as I recall it from the PSI. And as Ms. Bonjean pointed out, he has a life expectancy of not hell of a lot more. I mean, not maybe 8-10 years. Now, of course, that's a life expectancy, which is based on statistics, not on he may outlive it all. He could not live it, or he could not live it. But it's important to note that he is 56 years of age, and he will not complete his sentence from New York until he's at least close to 80 years of age. So the government is asking to add another 25 years, which assuming that which could be as much as 107 before he gets out. Now, there's no question that, well, I suppose there's a theoretic possibility a person could live to be 107, but it would not be anywhere near what he could expect. So his chance of surviving, based on statistics, the sentence he already has is not good. But the sentence that the government is proposing, it would be there's no chance. The U.S. Sentencing Commission has indicated that a de facto life sentence is 470 months, but that's based on the average age of a prisoner receiving such a sentence, which is, I believe, the average age is 37. The median age is 36. So you've got a big discrepancy of close to 20 years difference between what they consider to be a de facto life sentence, 470 months for a 56-year-old person. But a sentence, if consecutive, and if I gave the sentence that the government is requesting, you're talking about 660 months, which is a rather substantial above what's considered already to be de facto life sentence. Now, the guideline manual identifies age as a potentially relevant sentencing factor. That's 5H1.1. Life expectancy is a relevant factor for older offenders. Now, the Seventh Circuit case of U.S. versus Werzinger stated, there is a worthy tradition that death in prison is not to be ordered lightly, and the probability of a convict who would not live out his sentence should certainly give pause to the sentencing court. In cases that don't recognize age as a factor, where it's been refused is for a downward departure, not for an upward departure. Now, we get into the issue of the deterrence and protection of the public, which is a very important issue in sentencing. And that's been impressed by the government, saying that this man, he should not be allowed out where he's going to be doing exactly what he did before. And Judge Posner said courts often acknowledge a lower rate of recidivism among older defendants. That's U.S. versus Jackson. So the specific deterrence here would appear to be relatively minimal. Defendant would be 80 if he's alive when he gets out of the New York sentence, or close to 80. And his method of operation, his MO, as came out during the course of the trial, was grooming these young individuals. Now, he was grooming the young individuals when he was in his 20s, and he was a millionaire, and he was a superstar. When he gets out in the 80s, there will be few of them that would be susceptible to his charms as an 80-year-old with no money and no prospects. 80-year-olds are more interested not in grooming young women, but probably in their prostate and their arthritis and the other, all the factors that go into the aging process. Y'all might not have heard me for like the last 10 minutes. I'll have to check and see, because I had this, the microphone was like up against my my shirt, so I apologize. So anyone, as far as if I was going to sentence I would probably have, considering all the factors that I've outlined before, I would have probably had a variance upwards from the top end of the guidelines, which was 168 months. Again, I think there was some evidence, justification for the obstruction, and because of the increase in the current guidelines, so that in all probability, if I was sentencing Mr. Kelly as a result of, I would probably give him a sentence in the neighborhood of 240 months. So I will. It seems to me that under all the facts and circumstances, that is a valid sentence, the 240 months. But I'm going to make the only part that's going to be consecutive would be 12 months. So the sentence would be 228 months concurrent to be followed by 12 months consecutive. I'll have to work that out on the various counts, but that would be the sentence. What was the terms of supervised release of Judge Donnelly? Does anybody know? And then Bonjean said, I do, Your Honor. And then the judge said, what were? And then Bonjean said, hold on, I have to pull it up real quick. And then the judge said, pardon. And then Bonjean said, I can pull it up real quick. And then the judge said, is it much different than what Mr. Alper has suggested? I guess, put another way, Ms. Bonjean, have you reviewed the proposed terms of supervised release? I have, Your Honor. I think, well, it's relevant. It's not particularly relevant. Are there any that you object to? And then Bonjean said, I did not see any, Your Honor. And the judge said, is the government satisfied with the proposed terms of supervised release? And then Appington said, I'm sorry, Your Honor. And then the judge says, the terms of supervised release that were suggested by Mr. Alper. And then Appington says, yes, Your Honor, those are acceptable to the government. And then the judge said, okay, so I will make them concurrent with the terms of supervised release imposed by Judge Donnelly. I assume she did have a term of supervised release in the sentence, did she not? And then Bonjean said, yeah, she did. And then the judge said, okay, now whether or not that can be done, I don't remember Donnelly having no supervised release provisions in that sentence. Do I need to go back and read the sentence from the New York case? Child, so Mr. Alper said, I believe that there can be different. And then the Judge said, pardon. And then Alper said, I do believe that there can be different sets of conditions. He has the New York conditions and the Chicago. And then the judge said, I said making them concurrent is probably irrelevant anyway based on the length of the sentence. And then Bonjean said she ordered 5 years supervised release, Your Honor. Okay, I'm confused. So is the 5 years supervised release following the 30 years? Because that's what it sounds like. Because when most people get out of jail after serving their sentence, they still have like certain amount of years of supervised or months of supervised release to make sure that they get acclimated back into the world. Okay, so then the judge said, all right, why don't we just leave it that way? Do I have to impose a term of supervised release? And then Alper said, yes, Your Honor. Okay, why don't I just impose a 5-year concurrent one under the same? Is there any objection to that if I make them under the same? And then Alper said, Your Honor, I will note the maximum term of supervised release is 3 years. And then judge says 3 years. Okay. 3 years concurrent to the 5 years then, and I'll waive a fine because of inability to pay. So the sentence is 240 months, and then he says 228 months. Okay, 228 months concurrent, and then the 12 months consecutive to the New York sentence, no fine, term of supervised release. What did I say that I wasn't going to impose? And then Bonjean said 3, right? And then he said 3 years concurrent under the same terms as imposed by Judge Donnelly. Okay, so it's not 3 years of supervised release after he serves 3 years. It's 3 years of supervised release after the sentence is served. So he still has to serve the majority of the time, and then it's sort of like probation. So I'll give you guys an example. Someone I know just had their life sentence converted to 30 years, right? Time served, and they had been in prison for 30 years. So when they were released, they had to do 3 months of home confinement, and then I believe 5 years of probation, where they have to check in with the probation officer. So that's what this sounds like. So it's not after 3 years he would have supervised release, and then if the New York case was overturned, he would be able to get out. No, he still has to serve the majority of this term. So also, how many counts is the $100 special assessment for how many accounts, and then how many counts? And then Appington says 6, Your Honor. And then the judge said 6, so $600 special assessment. And then he said, Mr. Kelly, you're entitled to appeal the sentence imposed. Do you understand that? And Mr. Kelly replied, yes, sir. And then he said, I'm led to believe by Ms. Bonjean that you intend to appeal. And Ms. Bonjean, you will take care of filing the notice of appeal for him. Is that correct? And then she said, yes. And then the judge said, and Mr. Kelly, if you can't afford an attorney while on appeal, one will be appointed to represent you. Do you understand that? He said, yes, I do, Your Honor. And then Mr. Alper interjected and said, Your Honor, 2 things. 1, I just checked and I did misspeak. There is no mandatory supervised release. And then the judge said, okay, child, these people know what they're doing. Then he said, all right. And then Alper finished his sentence and said that must be imposed. There's no minimum term. And then he said, okay. Okay, wait a second. Then he said, okay. Wait, hold on a second. There's no minimum term. Okay. And then he says, my other question would be, if you do, And that's Alper talking. And then the judge cut him off and says, just to make it easy, why don't we just not impose a term of supervised release? And then Alper said, the only concern with that, Your Honor, would be if something happens with the New York case and there is an appeal, then there would be no supervised release to follow in this case. And then he said, well, and then Mr. Alper continued and said, if for some reason that conviction was overturned or the case vacated, I do believe that a term would be appropriate in this case to run concurrent. And then the judge said, all right, I'll make it 3 years term of supervised release under the same terms as imposed by Judge Donnelly. And then Bonjean said, concurrent, Your Honor. And then he said, pardon. And then Bonjean asked again, concurrent. And then he said, concurrent, yes. So in the event that the sentence is vacated, now we proceed to the issue of restitution. Child, I don't think he know what he just sentenced the man to. So I have a few questions that I want to raise on the issue of restitution. Look, I'm tired. My mouse is tired. Okay. Let's see. We propose the issue of restitution. I have a few questions. What did Judge Donnelly provide for restitution? Did she issue an order of restitution? And then Bonjean, yes, Your Honor, she did. And we did have a restitution hearing. Her restitution order was approximately $370,000 roughly. I'm going to get the exact amount if you give me 1 second. And there, of course, $379,649.90. Your Honor, the restitution that was awarded there, I will point out, was based on actual data evidence of what it would cost to treat one of the victims, actually 2 of the victims, sexually transmitted disease that they claimed that they received or got from Mr. Kelly, and for a lifetime supply of the drug that treats that. That is a hotly contested issue, and it will be raised on appeal in the Second Circuit. But I want to make clear that that number came from an actual number for medication, one medication for the rest of their lives. It wasn't expert reports or any of the type of evidence that the government is trying to use here. In fact, I've never even seen anything of that type of evidence to be used in restitution. So that number was a number that was specifically connected to what the cost of a particular drug would be until the lifetime expectancy of 2 of the victims, or 3 of the victims as I sit here today. And that's where that number largely came from, $379,000 and change. So the judge says, one of the questions I have, I guess, to the government is, and I appreciate the fact that the law provides that the ability to pay any restitution is not relevant or it's not a defense to restitution. But does the government have any notions that there is something available somewhere? And then Pozzolo finally speaks up, and she says, Your Honor, we have the same information that you do as far as what's seen, represented. And then he cut her off and said the government is his biggest creditor at this time, the IRS. Would there be any basis that the IRS would yield to the defendant here, or will they insist on their rights as the lien holder? And then Pozzolo said, Your Honor, I think that's precisely why the statute says that these things should not be considered, because it's looking into a lot of different factors. We don't know what's going to happen necessarily in the future. We don't. The courts have said that a defendant could win the lottery. That's the example the Seventh Circuit has used. So there's things that could happen in the future where he could, even if he has, a number of liens right now that could change. Judge, has the government done any research, or are you aware of any research by the IRS, by any of the judgment creditors, that they found out whatever happened to his rights to royalties? And Pozzolo said, "No, Your Honor, we don't have that." Let's see. We don't have that information. Miss Bonjean, Judge, I just want to point out I actually represent Mr. Kelly on a number of these civil matters, and what I can represent to the court is that A, it is entirely unclear. He does not know what percentage of royalty rights he even owns, frankly. That's one problem. Those royalty rights have been sold off over the years. It's not even clear what he owns. Second of all, the royalties that he has received previous to the Eastern District of New York case have now multiple liens on them. What was held by Sony is spoken for 2 or 3 or 5 or 6 times at this point. If you take into account the default judgments, which now with interest are close to $10 million, in addition to the liens by the United States federal government, that is a part. So this idea that there is money out there is, and the government has restrained everything, so they know what's there. They know that there's nothing there because they've not been able to get it. So all I can say is, yeah, I suppose you could win the lottery, but the reality is he's going to prison. He does not make music anymore. He cannot make music anymore. Whoever's leaking his music are the people making money, but he's certainly not getting any proceeds from any of the money. And whatever he has is spoken for, and we all know that is okay. The file actually closed up on me, so I think I'm back to where I was at. So let's pick up here. She says he cannot make music anymore. Whoever's leaking his music are the people making money, but he's certainly not getting any proceeds from any of his money, and whatever he has is spoken for, and we all know that his music isn't played because of the cancel culture and all that, and that's fine, but he's not earning income, and there will be no money unless something drastically changes. So then the judge says, there was something on the internet. It says, new R. Kelly album, I admit, is a bootleg, not an official release, according to Sony. And I believe they quoted you saying that you knew nothing about it either. Bonjean, that's right, Your Honor. I don't think Mr. Kelly would have preferred that title if he was going to be releasing music, but that was not released in any official way. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, there's been a lot of financial exploitation of Mr. Kelly over the years, and a lot of his music has been stolen. Judge, well, does anybody know who was responsible for that? Were there many sales and then Bonjean said no, because within like 24 hours, as soon as Sony said it was bootlegged, it was taken off the internet. So I don't know who released it. We did try to investigate, but we just don't know who released it, who had it. And he certainly made no proceeds from that. And I'm not sure anybody did, because it was removed very quickly. Then the judge said, okay, well, I have reviewed your both sides' multiple submissions on the issue of restitution, and it seems that while the law does provide for restitution to the victims in this particular case, Rishona, Pauline, and Nia, the government submissions seem to follow the line similar to a tort case, a civil tort case, as far as seeking damages are concerned, although they phrase it in a particularly different way. But the difference, it seems to me that the restitution is meant to be a simple or relatively simple procedure whereby the victims get together their actual expenses, the proven expenses, and bring them into the court or to the probation office or whoever, and then I get a report, and then the court would then issue a restitution order that defendant pay these bills. And I've gone through pretty carefully the submissions. The only really close to an actual item of actual expenditure is alleged by Pauline, who spent $42,000 for therapy services, most of which apparently were not covered by insurance. So I'm kind of, the rest, they say that basically that they're saying is that they should have received all this medical care. They should have received all this therapy, all three of them over the years. And therefore Kelly is responsible for what they should have had to spend, what they didn't. So it seems to me that what you're really talking about is a claim for tort damages, which of course, if there was a lawsuit, and there were a multitude of lawsuits against him, which of course, then you have the concept of discovery and depositions, so you can actually determine, cross-examine the experts who claim that this particular condition or that condition is causally related to the actual misconduct of Mr. Kelly. That's not the purpose, as I understand it, of restitution. The purpose of restitution is to reimburse for the expenses that they were caused to incur, and also to cause that for some future. But it seems to me there's been no evidence other than Pauline, I believe it was, one of them testified to $42,000, and that was Pauline who actually, and that would be, if she did, then that would be subject to the restitution. Obviously, future matters which haven't occurred yet could be if they're causally related. But I'm just having a difficult time getting through how to handle this restitution. So maybe I should turn it over to the government and ask you if you want to comment on my comments. Pozzolo: yes, Judge. Your Honor is absolutely right. The restitution statute provides that the victims should be reimbursed for their losses reasonably projected to be incurred in the future, and that's in Section 2259. That deals with the exploitation offenses before the court, and that statute, Congress, and the case law that discusses it specifically points out it's because the damages that is done based on these types of crimes is lifelong. And so people that have gone through that, and you heard it from the victims themselves today, they're still struggling. They still need help. And so what we've tried to do is put together information and assessment showing that this is still, one of many needs they have. But mental health care, you heard from the victims today, that is a top priority. It's expensive, and the defendant should have to pay for that, given that he caused the trauma by abusing them. And so, we put forth the case law in our memo here. It's not an exact science. We can't predict with certainty, the years of therapy that will be needed. But in many cases, Judge Kendall's Whitley decision, being one in particular, cited studies that show that it's a lifelong process. And so that's what we've come up with in terms of being able to estimate. And Your Honor can do that. You can estimate what will be needed based on the literature before you, based on Dr. Cooper's assessment that we put before Your Honor. So that is one of the main asks of the government that you impose. It's mandatory. Each of these victims must receive restitution. And so the issue becomes the amount. And so there's a lot of different ways you can calculate the amount. That's one of the reasons why the government had, asked the additional time for Your Honor to take these issues under advisement. And you guys, I'm sorry, I got the microphone up to my t-shirt again. So we wanted to make sure we had enough time to address those, allow defense counsel to weigh in on her arguments, and that's where the government's position is on this issue. And then he asked for Banjin. Hold on a second. Okay, and then Banjin spoke again. And she said, yes, Your Honor, the government continues to say that restitution is mandatory, and that is true if they meet their burden. It's not just you must give them a number. That is not the statute. They still bear the burden of demonstrating what the appropriate restitution number is. The government suggests that you can just pull a number out of the thin air based on some scholarly article somewhere. And the article that they actually cite for the cost is an article that talks about what the cost of abuse, or the R word, is for society. Not for Rishona, not for Pauline, not for Nia, but for society. The criminal justice cost. So it's completely inapplicable and should provide no guide for this court. Again, the individuals are not entitled to restitution for what it cost the criminal justice system to prosecute Mr. Kelly. That is not, and that's what that article is about. Secondly, they still have to show approximate cause. Now, here's the unique problem with this case. The conduct is 25 years old, and so the proximate cause issue is a little more complicated. And some self-reporting that my hypertension or my, feelings about something are caused by Mr. Kelly is not, it should require a little more than self-reporting. I think we should at least be able to see if some victims have actually sought mental health treatment in the past. So as the court pointed out, there is evidence that Pauline sought mental health treatment in the past, which I guess is an indicator and a cost. We don't have any receipts from that, but let's just say we take her word for it at that. But for instance, Rishona, there's not a single statement that she's ever sought mental health treatment. So for them to say, well, we're giving a number to project it into the future, we didn't even hear that she was going to seek mental health treatment in her statement. She's not here to tell us that. That does not meet the burden. Okay, so Rishona didn't. One of the reasons I wanted to get the transcripts was to see if Rishona actually showed up, so we know she was not there in court. And I asked the court if the court is going to consider Dr. Cooper's expert reports. This is a woman that spoke to these victims on the phone and then diagnosed them with possible things that they could suffer in the future. I'm not even sure how she did it. This is not the type of evidence that is reliable. It's not subject to any adversarial process. It's not. She's not subject to cross-examine. And how would she determine, for instance, one victim's varicose veins are caused by Mr. Kelly? I mean, it's really outside the realm. And there's this assumption that, at least with Rishona, that she's disabled for life. I mean, there is an Eighth Amendment issue that comes up with excessive restitution awards, and they have an obligation to provide the proof. They have had years to do it, and what they provided was an expert report that they can use perhaps in their civil lawsuit, which, with how statutes of limitations are going, they probably can bring. So that's what they have provided, but this isn't evidence of restitution. My papers also demonstrate that there's a whole question of whether expert reports paid for by a victim are even admissible on standing grounds. It is the government that is asking for the restitution on behalf of victims that they are entitled to if the burden is met, but not a plaintiff, a victim herself has no personal standing. And these reports, unfortunately, just don't provide a sufficient nexus between this, what they're projecting into the future, which has no past to corroborate it, and there's no nexus. Dr. Cooper doesn't explain how she reaches the conclusion that these damages into the future are related to Mr. Kelly, and there's a whole 25 years in between. What could account for at least some of this damage? We don't know. I mean, Rishona wants to blame Mr. Kelly for the death of her father. Her death, her father died, as I understand it, from a heart attack or something of that nature. I mean, I suppose there's a theory out there, but we should be entitled to question that. It's a little far removed. It's not what restitution contemplates. And if we're going to put any emphasis on these reports, we should have the opportunity to challenge them in a meaningful way. So I would object to the use of these reports as some type of ground, some type of basis for damages into the future for the rest of these women's lives, when particularly since there's no history that supports that they would actually go get mental health treatment except with Pauline. I guess since she has indicated she did. Finally, with Nia, as the court knows, she already sued Mr. Kelly and testified at trial that she received a $500,000 settlement. So, I mean, and the sentencing guidelines allow for an offset. So, it's too far removed. The proximate cause nexus has not been demonstrated sufficiently. If the court is interested in having that type of hearing, we could do that. But I don't believe that it's appropriate, and we'd object to the reliance on those reports. The court, well, it seems to me that the restitution is not intended to be in the sense, well, it's adversary, obviously, but in the same sense of a civil trial in which issues of causation are very, very iffy. So that it would require plenty of time, if there was effort to do so, for each side to hire experts and to depose them, and then have a full-blown same thing as if you had a civil trial, because obviously these three ladies have been seriously injured and are entitled to some kind of recompense. But it doesn't seem to me that restitution is the proper vehicle to do that. And so, with the exception of Pauline, child, at some point, Bonjean stopped talking and the judge started talking. I think I might have fell asleep while I was reading this show. But the judge is talking now. He says, and so with the exception of Pauline, I will award restitution of the $42,000. But it seems to me that as far as Rishona and Nia did recover. I thought it was $200,000 to $220,000, which she said in an affidavit, I think, that she actually recovered and her lawyer probably took the rest. So she would not be entitled to any. So with the exception of Pauline, I'll order restitution of $42,000 and deny restitution for Rishona and Nia. Anything further? And then Pozzolo says, Your Honor, just for the record, the government objects to this calculation, and we just think that, based on everything Your Honor saw at trial today, the literature before Your Honor, the case law, child exploitation cases, victims need mental health treatment. So at a minimum, Your Honor can estimate what that average hourly rate is. We included that information. You can bear that out over a number of years. It's very important to the government representing this district and the victims that we need to ask for that, Your Honor, and we feel strongly about this issue. If Your Honor's not comfortable with, the reports that we provided, we can, put additional information in front of Your Honor, and you have the ability to hold this over for a period of time. You can review additional papers and issue a separate order. We're asking that be considered. And then the judge said, I considered that, but it seems to me that what they should have done or should do is bring a civil suit against Mr. Kelly and then proceed accordingly. I appreciate the fact that he appears to be judgment proof, but as I guess I pointed out once, who knows, maybe if he gets a mega million, he'll get $1 million settlement actually. But if you consider the issue, the situation, the government, their liens of $10 million, as I understand the IRS, that with mounting penalties and interest, that they double pretty quickly. So if it was 10 million, it's probably 15 or 20 million now. So we're not talking about any really practical way that we can do anything for these people. But it seems to me that what they really should do is go the tort route and sue him for the damages that he obviously did cause to them, but without specific payments, with the exception of Pauline, who indicates she spent $42,000. I'm going to deny the restitution for the others. Anything further? Bonjean. Judge, the last issue that I would like to just place on the record is that historically, when Mr. Kelly has been either found guilty in the Eastern District or sentenced, the Bureau of Prisons automatically puts him on a watch. And the policy, as I understand it, is he is supposed to be assessed. Because of the Epstein factor, when you're high profile, they automatically put you on this watch. It seems like, and it actually required me to file a lawsuit against the BOP in the Eastern District because he was not actually in that state of mind. They put him on watch, and the watch is in and of itself a pretty cruel and unnecessary for his own mental health. In fact, it creates mental health issues. So I want the record to be very clear. Mr. Kelly was very aware of the sentencing, what he was coming into. He's already under a sentence of 30 years. He is perfectly understand what the consequences are. He understands his sentence here. He is not in that mental state of mind. And if the BOP conducts an appropriate assessment of him, they will find that he is not in that frame of mind. So I want the record to be clear. I also understand the court has its own limitations in how the BOP runs, but I do want to make it a matter of public record that I have spoken to my client. There are no surprises here, and he was expecting this, and there is absolutely no reason for him to be placed on a watch. And if they place him on a watch, that to me, that would be seen as an interpretation of punitive action that's unjustified. All right, as you point out, this is the judge. As you point out, that's an Article 2 or Article 1 job to do that sort of thing, not Article 3. And so the record will show that you have made that statement, and it's up to the BOP to make the decision, not for Article 3 judges. Anything further than, and then Abington said, yes, Your Honor, the government moves to dismiss the forfeiture allegation in the indictment. The judge says, all right, without objection, the forfeiture is dismissed. And then Abington said nothing further for the government. And then Banjing said nothing from the defendant. Thank you, Your Honor. And that was the official reading of the sentencing of the Northern District of Illinois versus Mr. Kelly. So guys, that's it for me. Go ahead and leave your comments below, rate the video, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. And until the next time, I shall talk to you guys later. Bye-bye.